Good morning. Welcome back to Ribbon Candy Hooking. I'm Deana. Sorry I'm late. Getting calls from the school 1 minute before the show. It is just that kind of a morning. Good to see you. Welcome back. Happy Wednesday. I have a great show for you today. Whew, just sweating it up. I just need to breathe a little. Teddy, I got a call from Teddy's school because he was feeling sick, and she's like, you need to come now to pick him up. And I was like, I'm doing a show in 2 minutes, and his dad doesn't drive, which is, as you can imagine, very helpful in these moments. But turns out Teddy is not actually sick. He coughed. So sick, coughed, sick. What a world. What a world. Stephanie, great to see you. Linda B, great to see you. Mom, you are on gray and rainy. Oh, the rain has departed. You're right. It's quite nice out there. I didn't have time to put my lights on in the studio, but I can see that it's still very nice out there. It's gonna be a pretty one. I'm one day post-COVID booster feeling the aches. Yeah, that is the thing, isn't it? The achiness. Karen, great to see you. You are on the elliptical. Good for you. I have been so busy. I have not been to the gym for the last couple of weeks, and I am feeling it. I just feel so sluggish and lardy, just gross. Doreen, great to see you. Light breeze in upstate New York. Linda H. in rainy Massachusetts, great to see you. Kirsten, great to see you. Thank you so much. I got in touch with Kirsten and said, I'm just going to be a minute late because I was in the car talking to the nurse. What a, oh, you know. Lisa, great to see you. I feel like my eyes are crossing right now. Crystal, great to see you. Everybody, I think he's already recovered. Just so aggravating. And they don't allow you to send an Uber to pick your child up, which is even more further aggravation because it's like, we don't live anywhere near the school because he's in this special autism program. So we're not like local, at all. Anyway, happy Wednesday. I am going to run a calm and nice show today. We were going to do our Halloween kind of spooky stuff. And then I realized that Monday, I can run a Halloween show on Halloween in the morning. That'll be our Monday show. So I'm going to do kind of a spooky last Halloween episode on Monday and roll in the Lizzie Borden rug and that conversation, kind of a storytelling episode on Monday. I thought today, let's conclude our conversation about the Currier Museum and the exhibit of G's Bend quilts. We were in the middle of that conversation where we cut off on Monday. So I thought makes more sense. Let's continue that now. News tonight starts the Design Like the Fairy Tale Storybook class. This is the biggest and best class I've done. I know I say that always. It really is. I ended up, it's going to be a many-parter. We'll move to a different fine artist next month for the Design Like series, but I know I'm going to return to the subject of fairy tales, partly because of the moving exhibit, the Pearl McGowan Teaching Guild moving exhibit, a fairy tale rugs. I want to be sure that you're seeing also this, right? Because it's still festive times until next Monday. That whole collection of beautiful fairy tale themed rugs that are being sold by the Honey Beehive that are being hooked by the Pearl McGowan Teaching Guild, that has been on the move and touring, and that's been super exciting for I think everybody who's been seeing it. I'll be seeing it in November in Montpelier. But in any case, the fairy tale class tonight is designed to get you designing. Whether you are an artist or not, it's meant to get you going with ideas, putting together your composition, and a lot of talking about the stories, talking about different facets of the story, different motifs, different symbols that might work in your designing. It's a super fun class. I've been wired the last 2 days, like ramping it up and fine-tuning it. And I put it all into the crucible that I always talk about in my head, and I ended up with Hansel and Gretel, Red Riding Hood, The Fisherman and His Wife, which is a very unusual one, The Princess and the Pea, Puss in Boots, and Cinderella, because they're all very different. And there are so many others like Jack and the Beanstalk and Rumpelstiltskin that I wanted to get to too, because they had elements that I thought would be great for a hooked rug design. But for this moment, I'm not even sure we're going to get to all 6 in the 2-hour class. So we'll see how it goes. But I hope that you're signed up. I'm looking forward to seeing you tonight. I have such good energy about this class. We will be working on this idea for the same 6 designs and refining them within different categories. So it'll be a fun class. I also started working on this last night while I had the kids at karate. I thought, let me just take a little time off to hook because I don't get enough of that. April, great to see you. Quiltessa, great to see you. I drew up a turkey, like just drew him right up without any thought he has a little turkey hat on, and I gave these kinds of stacked, like here, these stacked kinds of trees that look like a bit like cotton candy, and some in the sky. I think I'm going to take out the date. It's too busy. But I'm getting going on that. The Familiar, the one with the witch for October, is selling like crazy. This is the same size, so this could be a great companion to the Familiar if you are liking both of those. So those are things that are happening now. I'm putting a bunch of stuff on Ribbon Candy Hooking, including a free pattern today that I don't think I had time to download to show you. That phone call really, as you can imagine, it got me. It got me. I'm just checking to see, because if I have it, I can show you. Of course I don't. I'll see if I have it a little bit later when we have a minute. I thought maybe I could just show you. I downloaded a free pattern for you based on these G-Spend quilts because I thought that could be fun, and that's part of our conversation coming up now. Hold on just a second. I'm not going to do stuff like this live often. I just want to get the pattern in my hand to show you. Send pattern from today. Okay. Yeah, good. So I'm getting some help. So let's go back to G's Bend and see where we were, see where we left off. I want to pick up there, and I also want to just walk through some of the other art that I told you was there in this Currier Museum in Manchester, New Hampshire, that is truly amazing and worth seeing. And if you don't live locally, you're seeing part of it here, but if you do live anywhere near, you should move the earth to get there because it is super, super fun. Let's pick up where we left off. Anita, good to see you. Good to see you. I saw the picture of your mom. What a sweetheart. Let me come and see where we left off here. Might be a spoiler alert. Oh, spoiler alert. Sorry. Oh, God. You know, I think we left off right around there. Let's just back it up a little bit. So if you caught Monday's episode, yeah, let's back it up just a little bit. And we'll walk back in. If you caught Monday's episode, we were talking about, well, this is one of the last ones we looked at. We were talking about the, I'm not going to do the history again because we did it on Monday. We really nailed it. But we were talking about this bend in the river called G's Bend on the Alabama River in Alabama, and how since the 19th century there have been women there who have been piecing together quilts that are now known as very high-end folk art. Since this man, last name Arnett, sort of gallery owner, middleman, found this group of women, recognized their work as being something exceptional, design-wise, folk art-wise, and started to promote them. And now their work sells for like $25,000 a quilt within the period of, within 20 years. So, oh, we got something going on in the thread. I know somebody's going to block that. We've had a lot of that lately, haven't we, on our Facebook group? So we were talking about how unusual these quilts are, in that they are not traditional at all, not using templates, not using squared patterns, very improvisational. So let's return to that mindset and look at some of this design because it crosses over really well to rug making. I'm going to tell you how it does and how it doesn't. So let's go back in and remind ourselves what these quilts look like. So this is one of the ones that is at the Currier Museum in Manchester, New Hampshire. And hold on, I'm just coming back to, oh, I got so many slides for us, it's hard to figure out where we left off. Isn't that a peach? All right, here we go. And we looked at a close-up of that. We're just retracing our steps. Remember with the slideshow, in between the slides, I showed you the plaque so you could do some research or follow up. If this is a subject that you are passionate about, you might want to look at the slideshow later, right? And just pause and look at stuff so you can refresh and regroup. Let's start with this one. So this is one of the Emma Petway quilts. We looked at a couple of her quilts. I think we saw this one. We had just started when we left off on Monday talking about design, talking about how these are not symbolist quilts. This is not symbolist work. This is abstract work. The main principle at heart, at the core of these G's Bend quilts, the project from the 19th century to now, at the core of it, it is piecing together strips, cutting up narrow strips, piecing together strips. Most of the quilts will have a sort of strip or line-driven composition because they are cutting strips and then grabbing strips and putting them together to make a composition. which is, you know, to be honest, sometimes very successful, sometimes less successful, often in the eye of the beholder, but nonetheless. You know, for me, some are better than others, and for you, I'm sure there will be too. Now, this is just an example of another strip quilt. It's not just another, is it? Because the color placement is intuitive and it's really striking. And I think that's one of the things that makes this conversation about Gee's Bend so interesting, is that whether we're talking about the very early 19th century quilts or we are talking about the contemporary last week quilts, um, I'm just wondering if that person in the thread is going to keep going, if they've got more for us or what. But the thing about them that they have in common, both new and old, is that the design is 9 times out of 10 really intuitive and strong. There is something about the simple composition, something about, oh, Carrie, good to see you. Something about using that little bit of white on the bottom right that makes it for me. Because without that, we would be looking at like a protracted, sort of elongated log cabin. With it, we are looking at a piece of contemporary abstract art. That makes a big difference. Also, the binding on it, those little bits of black, the little bit of black at the bottom of the white piece in the body of the quilt, unexpected. Thank you, Doreen. I was worried. Thank you, Crystal. Really unexpected, right? So when you think about quilts, textile design versus rug design, this is a design that would work out great. This would be a fantastic contemporary rug, right? IKEA would love this. Wayside would love this. Carrie Clarkson would be advertising this. This is a great design, right? These are simple, strong colors, very basic designs. We definitely saw her picture, right? We went a little bit beyond. We looked at the postal stamps because remember the U.S. Post Office put out a series of Gee's Bend quilt stamps. Probably super collectible. I wonder if they're still available. One of the other things I wanted to say about the quilts that are driven by lines is that in quilting terms, Quiltessa, you're going to know this for sure, they are called string quilts. So it's a little bit different. I'm picturing through the years these women of Gee's Bend cutting up scraps of anything that they could find into strips, keeping them as long as possible. Pants, these sleeves of shirts and dresses, and ending up with a lot of long pieces. And as a result, we get a lot of line-driven compositions in these Gee's Bend quilts. But in quilting terms, anything with long lines that's made up of little strips like that is typically called a string quilt. And that exists through history too. Even though Gee's Bend is geographically a very isolated place, remember the post office opened but the ferry closed like 11 years later, they have historically been very under supported locally, right? And as a result, isolated. But these ideas are not necessarily original ideas. I don't know the breadth of what they have seen in their experience, their exposure to art in other forms. But I do know that the string quilt goes back to also the 19th century. So these are not new ideas. It's just the interpretation of which make them exciting. This is definitely the interpretation of a flying geese quilt. I know we talked about this when we left off, but done in such a Where's Waldo kind of a way, right? We've got all different sized triangles that are fit inside these red triangles pointing in all different directions. Oh, are you working on a string quilt? Oh, please post it for us and let us know. Reference this video so that people can look back and join in the conversation, so that they know what the reference is, right? Because these are such good designs for rug making as well. Textiles are textiles, right? Lynn, good to see you. You know, this is one of the most common and oldest patterns, the flying geese, but I've never seen it done like this, right? Still tessellating triangles. I think we saw this one at the end when I was racing through, and this certainly reminded us that these Gee's Bend quilts do not have regular borders, right? Some of them might, but it's not part of the idea that they are finished and polished and squared off. That's not one of the attributes of these quilts. Thank you, Quiltessa. I would really like to see it. I'm actually working on one too. I'm halfway through a video on a string quilt that I hope I finish soon because it's a Halloween quilt, or we're going to have to wait till next year for that guy. But what I love about this is the color. Mondrian, right? This is so block driven. Hollywood squares, Mondrian, whatever you like, you choose. But it has that feel, doesn't it? And it still has that log cabin feel because we are talking about in quilting terms, what is called the wonky block, right? That's a British word meaning crooked, W-O-N-K-Y, the wonky block. Say that 20 times. And this is a good example of that, right? You're just piecing strips, strings, piece by piece, block by block, tessellating them, turning them, twisting them, moving them, changing their orientation. In this case, adding only one other color, but that color is extremely meaningful. It creates almost like an X-ray effect or skeletal effect where you're seeing two layers. You're seeing the patchwork part, that's the dark and the pattern, kind of a calico and a dark, and then you're seeing this bright part on top. That's the poison in rug hooking terms. And you're even seeing a little bit of navy and red. Can you spot those little bits that are different colors that are just slivers, little slices of pie? I mean, these are just extraordinary quilts. The improvisational quality of them, for me, is what makes them extraordinary. Something like this as well, where you have a handful of warm colors, and then you use a bold neutral like black to piece it all together, right? It really adds so much, and we're not talking about equal pieces, right? The black, some of the bars are thick, medium, small, very small, and in some cases the black isn't even present in between the colors. So very improv. I mean, this is about as theater as textiles get, right? I mean, it really is. This to me is closer as a textile to music or live theater, improvisational theater, street theater, than it is to quilt making or rug making, just because of the feel of it. It is so super evocative. It's crazy. Wendy, good to see you. Wendy, I'm going to mention you later in the show. You'll see why. I won't spoil it, but you'll see why. This is an example of a contemporary wonky quilt block. So in other words, these Gee's Bend quilts are, they're making quilts the best they can with what they have, the tools they have. They are at this point creating quilts that are based on the history of the place and the history of the quilt making, their ancestors, their mothers and grandmothers and great grandmothers' quilts, based on those designs. And the wonkiness lives on as a result. Is it a hat tip? Is it a style that they have consciously invested in? I think at this point it must be, right? Because it's very noticeable, the wonky quality of them. I'm going to pause with that thought and just show you. I mentioned when we were at the museum, I picked this puzzle, which is going to be a great puzzle, I think, to make. But this is the Quilts of Gee's Bend puzzle. And it's not unique to the museum. So this is something interesting that you might want to look for online. It's probably like on Amazon and all over the place, but we got it in the gift store when I was with my mom. But it's filled with all these Gee's Bend quilts. And if you're a puzzler, 1,000-piece puzzle, this is going to be a great project for you. Also super inspiring. But the idea of doing quilt blocks that are not squared off and perfect, that is not a new idea, and it is not a unique idea. So I'm putting it out there because I'm saying while we honor the makers of Gee's Bend, it is an idea doing something in a very irregular manner that Mondrian had, that people had long before, and that you can have too. So for example, contemporary quilt maker, a documentary on Gee's Bend's quilts popped up right after the last coffee hour. Isn't that fantastic? That must have been that crazy voice recognition thing. Oh, the monster inside the computer was listening again. Remember he was listening last Christmas when I played that stupid Christmas song and I got in trouble? Always listening. So, all right, wait a minute. Let me come back. Let me come back here. So this is a huge departure from a log cabin quilt. Whether you're a quilter or not, you can see the bottom right is truly, it's actually, that's courthouse steps, which is a variation on, I love that puzzle too, Mom. Courthouse steps is a variation on log cabin. You can see the placement of the angles is different. But then you can see in the other three blocks a massive departure from the traditional, I think this is a Gee's Bend quilt still. This is a Gee's Bend, I'm sorry. It's contemporary, but it is a Gee's Bend. I'm about to move away from Gee's Bend and show you other examples, but this is just showing you the amount of play and the kind of legs that this block has. You can take it in so many different directions, even these string swatches of many colors pieced together. Isn't that something? I mean, in terms of unity, for me, this is not the most unified of the Gee's Bend quilts, but to me, it's something to look at and study as a color composition, as a breakdown of lines. I don't know that it's the most successful for me in terms of the way the lines work, but interesting talking point. I pulled up a copy of this book. I have this at home. It's called Log Cabin Quilts with Attitude, a new twist on an old favorite. If you're a quilter or you just like this subject, Sharon Rotz put this book together that is filled with quilt patterns that are wonky. It is exactly what we're talking about. This is not the only log cabin or quilt book that deals with wonky quilt blocks, but this is the backbone of the Gee's Bend quilt, right? And this is a Mary Hogan book, also on quilting, Quilts with a Twist on Tradition, Log Cabin Improv. So these are a little closer to the ones that we're seeing, the earlier Gee's Bend quilts that are based on the log cabin pattern, but still quite different in patterns for today's quilt maker. Now, this is a quilt I found by Cindy R. Quilts, the letter R, on Etsy. So she's making wonky log cabin quilts. This one, she's selling them for $560, which is a formidable amount of money. Beautiful quilt, but for example, she's got them in different colors, in blue, in green. They are lovely quilts. They are quite similar, right? They are wonky log cabin blocks. Something to think about, something that can translate also to rug making. Now, this is another one of the Cindy R. quilts. She's also playing with the idea of the string quilt in her Etsy store. All of her quilts are $560 from what I saw. I didn't take a huge survey, but they all seem to be $560. This is also like a Gee's Bend quilt, using the string quilt components, using the strings, the long skinny parts. Now think about this as a rug maker. This is much more feasible, right? This is much more accessible to us. Nancy says the Gee's Bend quilts are made of scraps of corduroy and the most beautiful thing ever. They are, and some of the older ones are also a lot of wool, a lot of flannels. You get what you get and you don't get upset, right? The ultimate thrift quilts. So, for example, you going to Savers or Goodwill or whatever your local thrifty store is, you go and you grab what you like, the patterns you like, and even if they're different materials, whether you're quilting with them or rug making with them, it's gonna work. It's going to work. Now, the string quilt is a little bit different because if you think about, let me see if I have the image. Yeah, here it is. So this is the image I made that's a free pattern on ribbon candy hooking. Let me see if you can see that. It's kind of a breakdown of a lot of the different squares, right? It's not particularly squared here, but on the site, you can download this as a free pattern if you want to fool around with it. It'd be great for miniature punch needle. It'd be great for quilting. It'd be great for rug making. The part of it that is not great for rug making, right? So let's talk about this now because we want to talk about the crossover since we're basically a rug show, right, in the rug community. The string quilt that we were just looking at from Cindy R. Quilts was very geometric and straight. It was very squared. That works great for us as rug makers because we are always working on a woven backing that is squared. Now, for a quilter to make a wonky quilt, right, that it's not quite squared, not quite perfect, that's easy. For a rug maker to make a wonky square that is not quite even, that's hard. So I want to just put the disclaimer out there that if you're a beginner and you are a rug maker and you're thinking, oh, I want to make one of these Gee's Bend type designs as a rug, or I want to go for this design that I just showed you as a rug, this has potential to be challenging. It's going to be fun, but it's going to be challenging because you are going to find yourself having to choose where to break off onto diagonals. You're not going to go straight with the grain with these wonky anythings. The Gee's Bend, right, the backbone of design is that it is wonky, and that is hard to do on a woven backing, like linen or burlap or rug warp or monk's cloth. So you're going to have to face that. If you love this idea and you want to do it, it's not impossible. It's not a very high hurdle. It's just from a beginner point of view, you want to follow straight down lines because it seems to look best, it feel best, and it's the most obvious way to hook. But if you're hooking something that is pointedly not squared, you're going to have to keep making decisions as you go as to where that line is going and how far to move it, right? So that's the only thing that I would say about translating a Gee's Bend style quilt that could be problematic, right? Whether you're a beginner or not, if it's something you haven't done before, it has potential to be tricky. So hang on a second. I got to stop coming to you because then I lose my place in our slideshow here, and I've got a lot of slides. So this one you could see the Cindy R. Quilts. This one would be easier because she's very squared here. We're still looking at a string quilt. We're still looking at a very Gee's Bend feeling quilt. but it is squared, and this design would be more suitable, or at least easier, for a rug maker because of the nature of our backing. Quilters don't work on backing. Now, we looked at this one on Monday. This is the log cabin quilt, and remember I said the thing, the prestige, the trick about these log cabin quilts, and this is very Amish in design. It is a G's bend, but the Amish community is well known for the log cabin square, number one, and for using the light versus dark within the log cabin block. So I just wanted to show this because I'm about to show you how that shakes out. This is an example of a log cabin block. This has got many pieces. Your log cabin block doesn't have to have this many rows, but to give you the idea, this is what a light versus dark log cabin block looks like, right? So lock this into your memory for a minute. And also the red in the middle represents the fire at the hearth and home, right? Like a stable hearth home, the coziness of home, right? So that red center is very traditional, whether you want it or not. If you want it super traditional, keep the red center. This person did. This is an example of just a photo I pulled off of Pinterest or something, a light versus dark, right? So this is like a more probably early 20th century, same exact conversation, a log cabin that's broken up, light versus dark. Here's another Amish example, very artsy, light, not so much light versus dark, but color versus color. So they have broken it up in the same way, kept that red fire glowing in the center for the hearth, for the warmth, for the heart of the home, but they have, instead of playing with light versus dark, they play with color versus color, right? So some cool blues and purples versus some sort of neutral brown black, and they've kept that red in there. This is the same, I think this is the same quilt, or it's a similar quilt anyway, but you can see they are still doing the thing with the log cabin block, but do you see with your eye how with this design block, this must be a different one. Half of the log cabin is the colored rose and half of it is the solid blues, right? That's how this is done. That's how you would get a pattern like this. Just good, oh Sharon, good to see you. It's good to lock this into your head if you're interested in translating a log cabin design to quilting, to a drawing, to a painting, to a song, to a rug, to anything. You want to understand the principle. Same exact thing with this. Every single square is half color, half black. And then you are putting your blocks together, individual blocks together on the floor or on the table, and you're moving them in such a way that you are creating your pattern as you go. Patterns are not infinite, but I'll tell you, there's a lot of ways that you can go. Here's another example with the light versus dark. These are literally light versus dark, and in turning the blocks in a different direction, they have come up with this pattern within a pattern, right? It's a Russian nesting doll of a pattern. It appears to be a log cabin block, but then again, there is a diamond pattern, almost like a mosaic floor, because of the way that they've tipped the blocks. Here's another example. You get these exaggerated zigzags when you tip the blocks a certain way, light versus dark. Isn't it interesting to know how far you can go with this one idea? I just love it. Now, in talking about the G's Bend quilts, there is another element of the quilts that make them, I don't want to say tricky because I don't want to put you off, but if you want to translate the feel of these G's Bend quilts to your rug making, the other thing that you need to think about, besides the wonky nature of the lines, is the border, right? Because the border is hardly ever, well, I think never squared, right? Sometimes an attempt at being squared, but not really. Sometimes no attempt at all at being squared. And now we come to the problem of, how do I do that? Well, I want to remind you that in this current issue of, it was Rug Hooking Magazine, my buddy Haley Perry of Loop by Loop in Warren, Rhode Island, she wrote that great article about her little watercolor miniatures that she translated into small hooked rug pieces, and she did shaped borders for them all. The whole article that Haley wrote was about using shaped borders. And you know what else will be the sort of real Bible in terms of unusual borders and shaped borders? Hang on, I'm coming back to you. And we covered this book ages ago. Judy Taylor, my love, Breaking the Borders. This is her latest book, The Rug Hooking Artistry of Sharon Johnston. And in this book, if you remember when we covered this, just about every rug in the book is, if not every one, not a squared border, like a fluid, unusual, unexpected shaped border. And she shows you in amazing detail how to finish off your borders when they are really unusual. So that will help you with the idea of doing a G-spend quilt and allowing yourself to do that unexpected border, that shaped border. Now let's see what else we can see. I'm moving on from the G-spend now. I love this subject, and we can always come back to this in the future, but I want to show you some of the other textiles that were at the Currier Museum in Manchester, Connecticut. Sorry, I'm having sniffling problems. It was such a stressful morning. Some of the other textiles here are definitely worthy of note, and I think will also be interesting for you. So this is one of them. This was a Victorian era quilt. I think it says 1884 in the center. And it's for, I'm getting a much smaller picture because of my view, but I think I remember this being for a baby or something. I can't read what it says in the middle, but I feel like it was a presentation quilt or a crib quilt. It was small for a baby, but it had some motifs that, and this is in the same room as the G-spend exhibit, right? This is in the same room. So this has some of the, and this is much earlier than the G-spend, the 5 G-spend quilts in the Currier Museum. It has a lot of the same feel to it because we're looking at blocks that are crazy quilt blocks, but very geometrically driven. There's a very strong diagonal pull to this quilt that you don't see in every crazy quilt. Usually the point of the crazy, oh, good morning, Cats Gallery. Usually the point of the crazy quilt is that it's completely chaotic. It's mayhem, right? It's just heavenly mayhem. This is a block-driven quilt. So they have created crazy quilt pieces, squared them into blocks, and sewn the blocks together like a patchwork quilt, right? A crazy quilt is a combination of patchwork and applique pieces and embroidery. So this is a bit of a different looking crazy quilt because it's a block quilt. So a little bit different. Now you can see there are some symbols that have to do with the family, not just the baby, like the Masonic crescent, compass, sun or eye. So another interesting small scale quilt in the same room. Here comes another one. It was a beautiful, so this is the information. Arlette Hathaway Howard, this is a crib quilt, dates back to 1884, hand pieced and embroidered. And it was a local quilt. Many of the things in this museum are local, and that's the reason they found their way into this collection, which I'm sure rotates often because they seem to have a crazy amount in the collection, and it's all such high-end and important work. A beautiful bed quilt, and we know that because it's shaped for posters at the bottom, right? You're going to pull it up. It's not, the posters don't affect the top where you tuck your head in, but at the bottom it does because you want the quilt to kill the draft and get right over the edge to the floor. This is a beautiful, very intricate star quilt. Look at the movement outside of the white part, how there are some changes and some improvisational to the diamond pieces, right? This would be super difficult to do by hand, and this is a by hand quilt because this quilt dates to the 19th century. It's a star quilt. There are lots of kinds of star quilts in quilting language. Sometimes the Lone Star is probably the one we see the most often now. This is Star of Bethlehem, which is a little bit different. It's so interesting to learn about the language of quilts because you learn, it's like the Rosetta Stone when you start unlocking the different pattern names. Star of Bethlehem is a beautiful, very complicated, not a beginner's pattern. This is a much more, good morning, Cindy. This is a much more traditional crazy quilt. That is an oxymoron. It is a Victorian quilt, and this one looks different. It looks different even from a distance, right? Just try to define in your mind, why does this look different? We're going to talk about it in a second. I'm going to bring you closer, but try to formulate a theory before we go too much further. I'm bringing you in closer here. You can see that this quilt is from Manchester, Connecticut, which is where the Currier Museum is. This quilt is still in the town that it was made in. I think that is so special. I'm going to give you a hint. Look at the embroidery part. Doesn't it seem very thick to you? It's beautiful. We've got lots of images happening here. There are pictorial images. There are birds. There's flower, fauna, all kinds of references. There's a Native American reference in this one. Lots of Jacobean work, right? Like copying pillows or wallpaper designs or whatever textiles. This one is dated, you can see on the left, 1868, I think that says. This is very, very thick embroidery because it's done with yarn. And it's quite thick yarn. Let me see if I have one more. Nope, that is definitely not it. This is embroidered with yarn. And the thing about that that makes it unusual, probably my guess would be that it was made by someone who was living with animals and had access to yarn, but not luxury floss, right? So the more remote you go in the 19th century, away from city centers, Manchester is a big town now, and it's very sort of cosmopolitan, and it's very well populated. But I'm guessing that in the 19th century, much less, right? So the further you went from your general store, country store, the less chance you had of getting those luxury items like silky threads and flosses that you would like to do luxury fancy work with. You might not have that, but you might have it in your head that you're still going to make a crazy quilt. So if you're going to make a crazy quilt, but you don't have that material, you're going to use what you do have, which in this case is yarn, and quite thick yarn at that. Then the problem becomes, do I have the right needle for it? When I thread the needle, is my yarn going to go through? Am I going to have to unply it so it will go through the eye of the needle? And how big of a hole? Is it going to be the Grand Canyon every time I prick a hole through my silky stuff? That quilt is mostly wools and cottons, so that's okay. But if it was silk, it would do quite a bit of damage, right? Because silk is so much more brittle and papery than wools and cottons. So interesting that this would have worked, because I'm telling you, standing in front of it, it was remarkably thick. I thought the word that came to mind, even though it's a lovely old historic quilt, I felt it looked a bit clumsy. I mean, isn't that awful? And shame on me. But then when I got closer, I said, well, it's because number one, they're using yarn instead of some kind of floss or silk thread. Number two, it's really thick yarn, and they don't have a lot of colors. They seem to have blue, red, yellow, white, and they seem to run out of green really early. So we're talking about like primary colors, which is giving it a more contemporary look and making it a bit confusing, but it is clearly marked, right? It is clearly marked with the year, and it is an early quilt, just very unusual. April says, looks like New Hampshire on Manchester piece. Looks like New Hampshire. Yeah, it should, oh, like that it says New, oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, my eyes can't do that. Isn't that crazy? And Wendy, good point. It has curved lines too. So curved lines usually with this kind of quilting are a testament to, they might be piecing it. If you're a quilter, they might be piecing it, but they might be applique piecing it too, right? If you're piecing it, you might want to be piecing it onto a border so that you can get these curves on, just sew them onto some less expensive fabric behind. Because it is hard to sew curves, isn't it? They might just be folding as they go and overlapping onto the piece before it. So when you do crazy quilts, it is improvisational in the same way that the G-span quilts are. You can do it any way you want, right? There's 100 ways, at least 100 ways to do it. It's just a question of what makes the most sense for you. Now we tend to do it in more modern ways because it's faster and we have different tools now. But for this person in 1868, this is really a feat. And you notice, even with the supplies that she's had, it looks like she is unplying and using different widths at different times with the exact same color of yarn. But also she's done some incredibly fine, like turkey feet, turkey tracks, right? And a lot of very simple lines. We're not seeing a lot of super complicated embroidery stitches in this. These are basic ones that most girls and women would have known in the 19th century, even the 1860s. These are basic stitches that if you went to school at all or if you had someone teaching you at home, these would be the ones that you would learn. Now this is a real departure, isn't it, from the quilt? And yet it's in the quilt exhibit. So this is an industrial quilt that is placed into the exhibit to get you thinking. And I think interesting, isn't it? It's obviously made of metal, and it's put together not with thread, but with wire. It's one of these contemporary pieces, something to think about. Carrie says, my mother made a crazy quilt that offered the best night's sleep because of its weight. As kids, we would sleep so soundly under it. It was a nice feeling. Oh, I bet. I bet. I'm going to turn my phone on mute. I'm sorry, I'm getting lots of dings. It must be because I'm a ding-dong. So beautiful. Oh, I'm reading the thread a little bit. Like a weighted blanket. I was just going to say that, Doreen, because I've been sleeping under a weighted blanket. Helps with stress and all that, having that weight on you. You feel like you're getting crushed in a good way, if you know what I mean. This is the plaque that goes with the industrial quilt. So integrated circuits with woven needle on metal plate industrial quilt 2002. American artist Anne Marie Kenney, born in 1960. So you can read these plaques later as well if you're interested in going through the exhibit. This was really the showstopper in the room. The Giesbens, the 5 quilts that were recently acquired were also showstoppers, as you can imagine. This is a Faith Ringgold quilt, and that is a name that I think most people who like art know. This is a big deal. This is a very big deal. So Faith Ringgold, I'm going to go down the rabbit hole a little bit and show you some of her other work. Insanely successful and important activist, artist. She does mixed media textile work. So, for example, painting on canvas, it's a painting incorporated into a quilt. This is what she does. This is what she's known for. It's a painting on canvas. Canvas is a material. You can quilt with it, right? You can sew onto it. You can also incorporate it into a rug design by sewing it onto your backing. It's just another textile. But she paints it like a proper painting. And we get some very important and exquisite work. Faith Ringgold, born 1930, American born. This piece is called The Bitter Nest Part 5, The Homecoming. This was made in 1988, acrylic on canvas and pieced fabric. And of course, the pieced fabric is the quilt. This is Faith. This is a rabbit hole. If you haven't gone down, you have to go. I mean, it's just, she's so good. And her crossover to the textile arts cannot be understated. Just like the Giesben quilts. And this one room of this museum in New Hampshire represents such an important moment in textiles, of all time. It has the Victorian quilts, it has Faith Ringgold, it has the Giesben quilts. It's just a small room. This is all stuff that's worth talking about. I just wanted to show you some of our other work. This is a rabbit hole you must go on your own. It's a lot of reading. Like I mentioned on the Monday episode, books, coffee table books on both the Giesben quilters and Faith Ringgold, completely different subjects. They are expensive books. They are limited editions because there have been so many exhibits over the years, both of these subjects, Faith being a person, Giesben being a subject. So there is material out there, and it's very collectible because everybody wants the definitive, the most information, these limited run museum brochures and publications that you don't get to see many copies of. And once they're gone, they're gone. They're finite. And not everybody thinks to list this kind of stuff on eBay. Not everybody thinks of it as a historical document and an important text. Some people just say, oh, look at this little thing. It looks like a piece of newspaper, and throw it away when they clean someone's house out. So be looking for this stuff if you find that you fall in love with these subjects. These are gallery-driven subjects. And there is a lot of material out there. And the rarer it is, the more expensive it's going to be. So this is an important piece, obviously. It shows a bunch of quilters working on a quilt together, community of quilters, working on a sunflower quilt in a sunflower with Vincent van Gogh appearing and coming to them in the background, probably as the muse, as inspiration. It is, Doreen, it's amazing. This is amazing work. And you can see the African American community is her subject, right? This is her life. This is where she comes from. She shows you a lot of New York City, the Brooklyn Bridge, different neighborhoods in New York. So again, she is combining painting on canvas, storytelling with lots of text, and then look at the border. Very traditional quilted border. She's putting together so many mediums in all of her pieces. I'm going to kind of fly through because I did a lot with cutting and pasting and creating the slideshow for you because I liked so many of these images, but they all deserve a lot more thought. This one has the same kind of composition as the one before it, another rooftop composition, cityscape, nighttime cityscape. She does a lot of that, dreaming at night cityscapes. Lots of text, of course, meaningful text in the borders. That's something that you can go down the rabbit hole chasing after. But then all of this beautiful patchwork, which is really familiar. So again, these are all Faith Ringgold images. This one is called Picasso Studio. Another storytelling piece, a lot of painted work, again, more patchwork. She's showing Picasso, and she's showing her interpretations of his work or his style, his inspirations. I just love these. I love this suspension bridge images that she does. There's so much symbolism in her work, too. There is something really precarious about suspension bridges, cantilever bridges, in terms of being a metaphor, right? So that's a rabbit hole you must go down. This is moving on in the exhibit to a different artist. And I wanted to show, there are only two works by this artist. I wanted to show, Kat's Gallery says, I met a rug hooker at Jean Shepherd's that got to meet Faith Ringgold. She made a rug inspired by Faith and shows it to her. God, I'd love to hear more about that. That sounds amazing. I mean, they're very intricate pieces, but my God, talk about worth the time, right? I'm going to kind of fly through the next images because I love the Picasso too, Carrie. That was like that. Well, I think the Picasso and the reference to Van Gogh are my favorites. This is a contemporary piece. This is done with wax crayons, meaning crayons. Remember the crayons, so like crayon pastels. Um, this is like a bow tie quilt pattern. Look at the picture with the image within the image here, right? So this is a storytelling piece. This is another sort of African American storytelling piece. The plaque, which I'm about to show you, does not give too much information, but you can see the figure in front is like a little boy and he's carrying some kind of crockery, some kind of like earthenware vessel. And in the second, and I'm not even sure it's a series, this is a log cabin composition, but you can see he has fallen down and the vessel has fallen with him. So these were a bit puzzling to me, and I didn't get a ton of information from the plaque, but these are by Richard Haynes, American-born 1949. The log cabin one is called Whispering Quilts, 2003, and the other is called Whispering Quilts Bow Tie, 2003. So both oil wax crayon on paper. I would love to know more about the stories behind those, but this is what the plaque offered, so that's what we got. I just want to walk you through some of the other parts of this museum that I thought were worth remarking on, particularly to textile artists and people who love art. This was a sculpture that we saw. I'm going to show you the info on this, but this was like foam and textile. It was a real fantasy piece. It was enormously large. I'm going to leave this for you to read later because I want to go through the rest of the slideshow before we get to the end. This piece is called Time for You and Joy to Get Acquainted, 2017. Wooden armature, so it has a wooden skeleton underneath, and otherwise it's made of polyfoam and fabric. And it represents this magical imaginary island where the brontosaurus live, and all these flowers are cropping up, and there's these monsters of many eyes like the rock. But I just thought it was really beautiful. It looked like a lot of like fleece material being made into flowers. Some of it actually looked hooked, like the pieces we're looking at here. And here, I just thought, cool. It reminds me of Proddy. The grass was this whole green world under the dinosaur's feet, the eyes with the rocks, and all of these flowers coming up. And it was really something to see. It was a massive work. And then, we came to, I mentioned that there are some really important paintings in this museum. And I felt really remiss not showing you some of the more important ones. So I'm going to kind of fly through. But there are a lot of important works in here. This one is by George Rouault, done in 1939, and it's called The Wounded Clown. This one, his work is often mistaken for both Braque and Picasso because, of course, they were both Cubists as well. This is not entirely Cubist, but you see it's in the family of. There is a huge glare in most of the rooms of this museum because of all the skylights. It is controlled and it is safe, but it's hard to get good pictures. But I thought The Wounded Clown was very touching, right? Very evocative image. This was my famous painting in the museum. This is William Zorach's Plowing the Fields of New Hampshire. Zorach, if you remember, was married to Marguerite Zorach, who we talk about all the time because she was a rug hooker and a painter. William, her husband, was a painter and a sculptor, and very, very well known, much better known than she was, as often happens. But William Zorach is a big deal, and this was my personal favorite. This kind of idealized landscape, right? This is New Hampshire, showing bits of earth kind of as rainbow that come down, kind of lamb's tongue style, right? Because they're also textile people. This was painted in 1917, incidentally. And I took some close-ups of the Oreo cows, of the men working in the fields. I just thought this was an extraordinarily beautiful piece that would lend itself very well to a rug cooking design. The men working in the fields, right? Not the costume, the clothing, that's my stomach growling, by the way. Not well articulated. That's not the point. The story about the men is not the point. It's obviously about the land and about the activity, the plowing itself. But even the fields look like lamb's tongue, right? They look scallopy, and this elongated bird looking out. It is just such an extraordinary piece. And they've obviously had Zorach exhibits at the Currier Museum in the past, because in their gift store, they had this temporary and rare brochure on William and Marguerite Zorak. So I haven't had a chance to go through this yet. And I will, because I'm wondering if any of her hooked rugs are in this, just to jog your memory. I'm not seeing them, but we'll certainly look at this one and this one. They had two publications on the Zoraks. And I just feel like we need to return to this subject again, because when we talked about Marguerite Zorak, you loved it. You loved it, and I loved it. It was one of those episodes of the heart. You know, it's a lot about their family, this one. Yeah, they're not putting rugs in, but maybe they put in the works that they had in the exhibits when they had the exhibits. I thought that was an extraordinary piece. I was happy to see a Zorak piece in person with my eyes. Now, let me fly through some of the other stuff so we can end on time. It is a stressful day, and I do want to call the school and make sure everything is okay. They had an Edward Hopper. Like, isn't this fantastic? Edward Hopper, American artist, right? I think everybody knows Edward Hopper. This one is called The Bootleggers, and it was painted in 1925. And it shows this boat of bootleggers, right? This is during Prohibition, coming up quietly in the night to this Victorian house. There's somebody waiting outside for the pickup. It's pretty sinister, isn't it? And it's not like a traditional Hopper, because when you think of Hopper, if you're thinking, is he the guy that does all those city? Yes, he is. Nighthawks, right? This is his masterpiece. He is the guy that does all those city scenes, right? Those early mid-century city scenes. So that Victorian house on the water, unexpected, but the subject is not. He liked a little bit of seediness and a little bit of crime. This was one of my favorite things, just this moment in the museum. They don't have a lot of early American stuff, but this portrait paired with this even earlier desk blew my mind. The portrait is by Samuel Miller, who lived in Charlestown, right outside Boston, Massachusetts. This was painted in 1852, and I just thought it was an extraordinary, beautiful portrait sitting on top of, are you kidding me? Robert Crossman's, and he was from Taunton, Massachusetts, 1729 desk. This is a painted desk. I love Hopper too, Karen. I love Hopper. Looks more like a sketch for him. Yeah, he did a lot of stuff that was very light and bright and not nighttime, but we just don't see it that much because it's not what he is sort of known for. It's not what that's not his masterpiece, but it's cool to see something different, isn't it? You know, that reminds me, I think I forgot to put the Georgia O'Keeffe into this slideshow. What a silly. Now, I put this in for you for later if you're interested. It talks about the WPA in New Hampshire, how in 1941 there was this push to create murals, right? And this is part of the work that Franklin Roosevelt did with his Works Project Administration. It was a federal program, federally funded. He did a lot for the arts at that time. He did a lot for the country at that time, least of which was the fireside chats, right? If you think of all the programs that he instituted during his I was going to say reign, because that he was the first president, wasn't he? I'm going on memory here, but that served more than 2 terms. Of course, this was like a really rough time in history. But this was his mural program, and he hired muralists to create art for public spaces. And this is one of the pieces that was created. 2 of the murals from this project are in this room at the Currier Museum in New Hampshire. This is one of them, and I thought it might be of interest to you because it has this, during the Second World War, raging, it has this peaceable kingdom feel to it. And I took some cropped close-ups of some of the details, right? It's so unlikely. I love the introduction of people into this landscape, too. I just thought this was an extraordinary mural. You see how soft it is, too? Very stylized. Isn't it super stylized? The little chipmunk on the left, the coonie on the right. Really beautiful painting. Family of black bears. This is just, I mean, this painting was the size of the wall. It was enormous. Little woodpecker. It's signed by, what is it, Musa Kim, Musa M. Kim, something like that. It is on the plaque, so you can refer back to that later, but it's an extraordinary piece. The second, oh, don't let me leave out the beaver doing his work here. He's making a little dam in the water. The second piece was also extraordinary. It was another mural from the same project. Different artist. Wendy, this is the one that reminded me of you, right? This is more this is man's work, right? Not so much a peaceable kingdom subject. Absolutely beautiful painting, and all of these close-ups, right? Super graphic. You know what really stuck out in my head when I was looking at these murals was that during this period in history, for rug makers, we were looking at the Pearl McGowan School, we were looking at realism and flowers in rugs. The fine art world was looking at stylizing art. They were not looking at realism. They were looking at stylization. And I mean, it just seems so striking to me that in the same years of history, women who were making rugs were looking to create utter realism. People who were creating works of art in murals were getting completely away from realism. I just think it's amazing. Exactly, Wendy. Woodpile, right? Woodpile, your woodpile piece that we looked at on gallery night completely reminded me. That was the first thing I thought of when I walked in this room. I saw this amazing woodpile. And I thought, Wendy, isn't it amazing? The birch tree for contrast there too. I thought it was just stupendous. And then there was this painting by Marsden Hartley, painted in 1939. It's called Abundance. Different kind of a woodpile. Much more of a cubist feel. You see the axe hidden in the middle underneath. Just thought that was cool. It went really well with the exhibit. Hey, in the same room, a Remington. This is what you get when you travel to New Hampshire and go to the Currier Museum. Here's your Remington. This is the Picasso there, woman seated in an armchair, 1941. Yes, there's a Picasso there. This is not a super well-known one, but this is the artist Will Barnett, Barnett. I love Will Barnett. Painted in 1949, The Awakening. So for me, this was a big deal. I love his graphic work. Ultra mid-century artist. If you don't know him, look up Will Barnett. You will be pleasantly surprised. This is a child Hassam painting. We talked about him a lot with the Florence Griswold episodes that we ran. He was part of that Lime School in Connecticut, that school of painting. He was one of the, probably the best known American Impressionist. And this is one of his most famous paintings in this museum, 1916, The Goldfish Window. Extraordinary. This is a sergeant, a John Singer sergeant. Sorry about the lighting, but there's no way to get away from it unless I grew go-go gadget legs and was 10 feet taller. Marchioness Curzon, painted in 1925. And there's a Monet there, 1869. This is called Bridge at Bougival. And we talked a lot about, in the Monet class, the Designing Like Monet class, that was, I think, the one from last month or the month before. We talked a lot about pathways for Monet. He loved his pathways. In Bougival, he's showing us two, and he did a lot of views of this exact spot, one down to the water and one up the high road and the low road to the village. So interesting. There's so much of everything at this Currier Museum. It is a mind-blowing place to be. That was just a taste of it. There was tons of contemporary art. There was a Georgia O'Keeffe. There was lots of everything. It was a full-blown museum, and then the two Franklin Lloyd Wright houses were there. I'm going to hit it, but I'll be back with you Friday. I'm looking at my phone and wondering what all that beeping was because I'm still worried about Teddy and I want to check in a little bit. So I will see you on Friday for cocktail time. I'm going to be doing it's a part game, a little bit of drawing, a little bit of trivia, looking at the history of Halloween-themed tarot cards, not in the sense of being all pagan, but in the sense of being Halloween-minded and looking at great design motifs in board games and tarot cards that have to do with this time of year that we can use for our inspiration in designing. So for Friday night, have a pad and a pencil near you. Get ready to answer some trivia questions, and we are going to have a fun game-based Halloween episode, very cozy on Friday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I will see you then. If you need me in the meantime, ribboncandyhooking@gmail.com, and I will see you on Friday. Have a great day in between. And I'm looking forward to the class too. Make sure you're signed on to log on either tonight or Sunday. Same class runs twice. Different conversations, right? Different people, but same content.